Hello and welcome to Tech Deals Build Guide. This is part 3 of the $4,000 Ultimate Computer Build. This is a no compromises, do everything computer system. Parts 1 and 2 will be linked in the video description below. If you have not seen those, please go check them out. Go look in the video description for the entire video series. Part 1 is quite simply the what. I talk about each of the parts, what they are, why they're here, what they cost. Part 2 is a much longer video. Not everybody has to watch that one, but if you are interested in the behind-the-scenes decision-making process, Part 2 is the why. Why did I pick each of these parts? What do they accomplish? What else might you choose instead of these parts? Part 1 is less than 10 minutes long. Part 2 is over an hour long. So for those of you interested in detailed behind-the-scenes, go watch Part 2. Otherwise, go watch Part 1 for the short and sweet version. I will do an even shorter and sweet version here. We have got the Intel i7 6800K CPU, 6 cores, 12 threads. We're going to be installing it into this Asus X99-A2 motherboard. That motherboard is going to be installed into our Corsair Obsidian 750D computer case, full tower, awesome case. Our graphics card today is going to be the EVGA GeForce GTX 1080 for the Win Edition graphics card. We have 32 gigabytes of system RAM. This is 3000 megahertz DDR4 rip jaws for memory from G.Skill. I have got a selection of 5 SSDs. I did say this was an ultimate system build, did I not? The main boot drive will be the Samsung 950 Pro NVMe SSD. And then we have 4 other SSDs, the Crucial MX300, the Samsung 850 EVO, the ADATA SP550, and the SanDisk Ultra 2. The explanation for why there's so many SSDs are in the 2 previous videos. Power supply is going to be the Corsair AX1200i. If you haven't watched the previous videos, yes, it's overkill. No, most people should not buy this, but I got a good deal on it refurbished. Corsair's H115i 280mm liquid cooler will be providing our cooling, and our mass storage will be 4 8TB Seagate archive hard drives, providing a total of 32 terabytes of space. I did say ultimate, did I not? In fact, the SSDs and the hard drives are almost half the price of the system, which is why it's so expensive. And last but not least, we'll be putting this little thing in. This provides us with 2 more USB 3 ports on the back of our computer. I'll show that later. We have the parts set out on my build table. I do have my VisionTech build kit. This is a 26-piece part kit that I use for all of my computer system builds. It is a wonderful kit. I will link it in the description below. It's not very expensive, and it provides different size screwdrivers that are handy for building a computer. I also have, and all of you should have it for this kind of system, a set of cable ties. This was about $5 for 200 ties of various sizes. Use it for cable management. I highly recommend that you tie off your cables for better airflow in your system. Well, that's enough talking. To get started, I'm going to clear everything off the table, and we're going to start with the motherboard and processor. I have zoomed the camera in so you can better see the motherboard and the CPU. Several times during this video, I will bring the camera closer and further away so that you can see the detail of what's going on. Now, we're going to open up the box of the motherboard, and you're going to see that it's wrapped in an anti-static bag. Take this carefully out of the box and set this aside for just 1 minute. This is just a cardboard holder to protect the board from all the other parts in the box. We'll set that aside. There are various items in here, including a CPU installation tool, an RGB extension cable if you have RGB lighting, which we don't, so I'll set that aside. Serial ATA cables for our SSDs and hard drives. An SLI connector, but this is used for the old 900 series cards, not the new 1000 series cards from NVIDIA. We have a very detailed user manual with lots of information. If you are installing this and you want to know what goes where, every single component on the system, this is an excellent manual. Asus makes great manuals. We have a driver CD, which we will not use because we will download the latest drivers from Asus's website. A handy installation tool I will show you later, hang on, there we go, for the connection of the front panel connectors from the case. More serial ATA cables. our I/O shield. This is for installation in the case. And then this is very important. This is the M2 SSD screw. This will be for our Samsung 950 Pro NVMe SSD. Now you'll notice I've cleared the box out, and there's a reason for that. I'm going to use the box to give myself something protective to put the motherboard on. I could put it on the table itself, but the table is fairly hard. The cardboard of the box will give for the connectors on the back more than the table will. So go ahead and build on the box. We'll take our board out of the anti-static bag carefully, and then we will place our anti-static bag to the side. We will take our board. This is the top of the board, this is the bottom. I have it turned this way to fit within the frame. I suppose I could turn it that way, but it fits better this way. This is where our CPU is going to be installed. We have 8 total RAM slots. I'm just going to briefly point out some of the features on the board. We have 8 total RAM slots. We're going to be using 4 of them for our RAM. 4 will be free for future RAM expansion. Our primary graphics card will go into this long gray slot. If you want to add a second graphics card, on this particular board, it goes into the 3rd slot, not the 2nd slot. There are various connectors around the side of the board. In addition, at the top of the board, there are 2 CPU power connectors. Yes, you should use both of them, and you need a power supply that provides power for both a 8-pin and a 4-pin ATX power connector. You have your 24-pin power connector. You have 10 serial ATA drive ports on the side. You have a U2 port over here. This is our M2 SSD slot, which is where our 950 Pro will go. There are 2 headers here for where we'll plug our front panel USB ports into the front of the computer. This is USB 3. I mentioned this at the beginning of the video. This connector is actually going to plug in right here and provide us with 2 more USB 3.0 ports on the back of the machine. I want to point this out because it'll be hard to see when the stuff is inside the case. These 2 ports here are your USB 2.0 ports on the motherboard. What are we going to use those for? Well, we're going to use those for 2 things, our power supply and our liquid cooler. Our Corsair liquid cooler that goes on top of the CPU has got a cable that will plug into one of these plugs. If you're wondering where that plugs, it's one of these 2. That provides Corsair Link to allow software in Windows to talk to the liquid cooler. Our power supply, the AX1200i, also, that's what the I means, also has Corsair Link, and we'll plug that one into the other one. This does mean that we cannot use our front panel USB 2 ports. The Corsair Obsidian 750D case that we have has got 2 USB 3 ports and 2 USB 2 ports. We will be using the 3 ports on the front of the case with this connector. We cannot use the USB 2 ports because we'll be using both of these connectors. If you buy a power supply that does not have Corsair's Obsidian Link, no worries, then you can plug in the front panel connectors using one of those plugs. This connector right here, labeled AAFP, is your audio panel for the front. This is where the cable goes from the headphone and microphone jacks from the front of your case. This is a COM port. If you added a serial port to your case, we will not be using this. And pretty much that's about it. Your sound chip is over here, your heat sinks are here, and then this is the back panel where your out ports go. So, enough about that. Let's install a CPU. So we have our Intel processor inside the box, and we are going to open this up. And if you look inside of the box, you will see a handy instruction guide, which you can certainly take a look at if you want. And on the back is an Intel Core i7 sticker if you want to put that onto your case. Otherwise, there is not much inside the box. I'll set that aside, other than the CPU, which we will carefully take out of the packaging. How does it come out? I haven't taken this out yet. There we go. Carefully take that out so we don't drop it. Very nice processor, very expensive processor. Taking a look at the CPU inside the plastic, if you take a look, there are no pins on the CPU. The pins are on the motherboard. Now, there's actually more than one way to install this. ASUS does provide a CPU installation tool. I personally have actually never used one of these because I just put the CPU in the socket. I imagine that this could certainly be helpful. On the other hand, I've also read that this causes more trouble than it's worth for some people. You could certainly use it to hold on to the CPU, but I'm not going to. Instead, what I'm going to do is there are two levers on an X99A board. The first one is here, and we're going to push this in, and we're going to do the top one first, excuse me. And we're going to release this. All you have to do is bring it in to release it. And then once that's up, the second one will come over. There we go. It's spring-loaded, so it pops back automatically. And this one probably doesn't. No, that doesn't. You can lift up this. Now, this is the part where you want to be really careful. The pins are actually in the socket, not on the CPU. You need every one of those, so definitely be careful. In addition, there is a protective cover right here, which is actually supposed to come off automatically once you install the CPU, but I've never been a big fan of that. There we go. So I'm going to take that off because that's what I prefer to do. Now, CPU time. By the way, if you ever have to return the motherboard for warranty, they want this still on there, so put this back into the box with your case. Don't throw it away. The motherboard box. Save the motherboard box. Now, the CPU. The only thing you should touch on the CPU is the sides. Do not touch the contact pads. Do not touch the top where our liquid cooler is going to touch. And then what we're going to do is we're going to align the two notches on the top and on the bottom of the CPU. On the socket, there are two notches there as well. And so we're going to very gently set the CPU down. This particular CPU actually has the label facing to the top of the motherboard. The notches are tagged so that you cannot install them the wrong way. The bottom set of notches is narrower than the top set of notches, so you can't install it the wrong way. At this point, we're going to bring our cover back down, and we are going to lock this into place very carefully. There we go. And then we're going to bring this lever down and lock this in place very carefully. Our CPU is now installed, and it's being held on the bottom and the top using the socket brackets on the heat spreader. At this point, the CPU installation is now complete. The next step is going to be installing the back plate for our liquid cooling. So I have to turn this over, and we'll go take a look at that. I now have our Corsair H115i liquid cooler on the desk. I've simply moved the motherboard down just a little bit to give us some room. I am going to open this up, and we're going to take some of the pieces out. There are instruction manuals here, and you definitely are going to want to have at least a glance through this so you can see there's the warranty guide, how to install it. This comes with the parts necessary for both, I should turn it this way because you are looking that way, for both the AMD and the Intel, which is in the front. This comes with the brackets and plates for 3 different types of sockets. So definitely have a look at that. Inside this box, you're going to find a pair of 140 millimeter fans. We're going to set those aside. We don't need those right now. And then you are going to find a large parts bag that contains all sorts of parts for installation onto different CPUs. We'll set that aside for a minute. This is our Corsair Link cable. I mentioned before that this connects to the USB port. On one end is a USB micro port that plugs into the cooler itself. And then on the other hand, you have, if I can get the camera to focus on that, the USB 2 plug to plug into the motherboard. I'll set that aside. We'll connect that later. The big thing, of course, is the radiator and the cooling unit, which we will take out carefully. When you take this out, make sure you keep the plastic cover on. This has pre-applied thermal paste. Once that touches something, it gets messed up and then you have to replace it. You don't want to do that, so be sure to keep the plastic cover on. And then we're going to take this entire unit out of the box. I'm just going to set it over here for a second, and then we will get the box out of the way. I now have all the parts from inside the box laid out on the table. Something I wish to point out, if you're at all familiar with liquid coolers, this bracket here is for AMD processors. This bracket is for Intel processors. However, this being my first X99 motherboard, I learned something interesting. You don't use either one of them for an Intel processor. This is for LGA 1150, 1151, and 1155 processors. It is not used for the 2111 socket here. So that bracket can be put aside. This bracket can be put aside. These two bags of standoffs are also not used for this CPU. They're used for either AMD or Intel standard sockets. Instead, all we need are these four standoffs, which are designed for the 2011 LGA socket. We need the four screws. I suppose I'll put them all the same way. And then we have some additional screws here, which actually we won't need. So we'll put those aside. Out of all of those parts in the bag, the only things you actually need are these. This will be the easiest liquid cooling installation I have done ever. I cannot complain. The only thing we're going to do now is install these. On one end, it's long, and on one end, it's short, and the thread screws are different. All that you have to do here, and I will move the liquid cooler forward, and so I can move the motherboard forward. There are 4 holes on the motherboard already provided around the CPU. These standoffs simply screw in like so. It really is this simple. On, for example, an i5 or an i7 6700K on a Z170 board, you'd have to turn the board over, install a backplate, run screws through it. It's a big pain in the neck. This is by far the easiest liquid cooler installation that I have ever done. I was expecting to have to show you more. There you go. Put the 4 posts in place, you're done. Now we're going to place the liquid cooler aside. Why? Because it won't be installed until we have the motherboard in the case. The next part that we're going to install is the system RAM. Now, there are 8 memory slots on the motherboard. There are 4 gray and 4 black. What we want to do is install them all into either the gray slots or the black slots. This will give us our quad channel date memory. I am going to install it in the gray slots. Why? Because the ASUS motherboard manual suggested to do so, and I'm not going to argue with them. I have now taken the RAM out of the box. There are 4 modules here. They each come in their own plastic container. Be careful when you open these that they don't fly out, and you should definitely not do this over your motherboard like I'm doing so that I can film it for you. Each one of these modules is 8 gigabytes of RAM, and they're held in by plastic tabs. If I can take it out of the plastic, there we go. I'll set these down. I'm just bending the plastic container a bit to pull the tab out to get the memory out. Take out the other 2. Now, G.Skill does, if you care about such thing, provide stickers in the box if you wish to put these on the front of your case. I don't personally do it, but if you like such things, by all means do so. 2 stickers even. And let's get that memory out of there, shall we? 32 gigabytes of DDR4, 3000 megahertz RAM, and it's good RAM. This is CAS 15 RAM, which is pretty good for 3000 megahertz. What's CAS? Well, there's timings to memory besides just memory speed. CAS 15 will be faster than CAS 16 and slower than CAS 14. As memory frequencies increase, usually the CAS rating goes up. Before we install the RAM, we want to do something else. We want to pop each one of these tabs out on the gray slots to give us room to install the memory. The bottom end on this particular motherboard does not pop out. If by chance you're using something besides an ASUS motherboard, your motherboard might have tabs that pop out on both ends, but those need to be popped out. We're going to take our memory, and when you take a look at it, you will see what we call golden fingers along the bottom. These golden fingers actually are longer in the middle than they are on the sides, and that tells you that you have DDR or double data rate 4 memory. DDR3 memory is smooth across the bottom. There's no hump in the middle. Furthermore, the notch is in a physically different spot on 4 versus 3 memory, so you cannot incorrectly install the wrong memory. It is not in the middle. If you look on the slots on the motherboard, you will see that the slots on one side have the notch on the bottom, and the slots on the other side have the notch on the top. So, desktop memory installs vertically, straight up, straight down, straight up. There's no angling, there's no tilting. We simply align. There's notches here, there's guide notches that the circuit board goes into, and we simply line those up, and it slides straight in. You're going to apply equal pressure on both ends, and the end here will automatically snap in. There we go. We'll take our additional memory module, and we will slide it in. 2 clicks and it's in place. We'll do the other side next. And then last one. Side note, why am I using RipJaws 4 instead of RipJaws 5? Well, this memory, at the time I bought it, was a good price, and it's on ASUS's qualified vendor list. For a system of this caliber and a motherboard of this price, I highly recommend that you only buy memory that is on the motherboard manufacturer's qualified vendor list, QVL. If you go, for example, to ASUS's website and you go see the X99-A2 motherboard under support, there will actually be a list of all the memory modules. There's probably, I don't know, hundreds, if not 1,000 different memory modules. You can search for either on the list or on a site such as Amazon or Newegg to buy memory modules that are certified, that have been actually tested. Everything on that list, ASUS has actually put into the motherboard and made sure that it works properly. So our memory is installed. Now the next step is to put the motherboard into the case. We are now looking at the side of our Corsair Obsidian 750D computer case. If you look through the big hole, you'll see it's white on the other side, and that's because I've removed both sides of the computer case. They use thumb screws that look like this, no tools, just unscrew both sides, take both panels off. You will need access to both sides, and that is because the SSDs install over here and the hard drives and the cables will go behind it, so you will need access to both sides. Now the first thing we want to do is unpack some of the parts. I have actually not taken this apart, I've done nothing with it, so there's a couple of things to do first. First things first, over here in one of the drive trays, it may be in a different place for you. Inside one of the toolless trays is a set of parts. These toolless trays are wonderful. They've got pins for hard drive installation. We'll simply drop our hard drives in those later. They slide right in place and snap right in. What is in this box? I'll show you. Screws, twist ties, and other case-related accessories. I'll put the box aside. I'm just going to set this aside for the moment. There are a variety of cables that are twist tied here. We will have to undo this because it is in our way. Note, these type of twist ties are very common in these systems. I don't recommend that you use them for tying down your cables in your case. Why? Because there is metal inside here, and if you tie your cables down with this over, I really wish they wouldn't use them, over time, you run the risk of the metal inside the twist tie cutting into it. If you use plastic zip ties, plastic cable ties, that's not going to happen because they've got a flat surface and they're all plastic. So I personally will be either recycling or throwing these away and using fresh zip ties. Now what are these cables right here? These are the front cables to the case itself. Let me show you what these are first before I move them out of the way. The first thing we have is our USB 3 connector. This is going to plug into the motherboard. This is going to power the two USB 3.0 ports on the front of the case. We have two very similar but not the same plugs right here. One of them is labeled USB and one is labeled HD audio. The USB could plug into one of the USB 2 ports on the front, which is this one right here, but I'm not going to use it because my power supply and my liquid cooler are going to be using them. So this is not going to get plugged in. And then I've got HD audio, which plugs into that slot I showed you on the motherboard earlier. What else do we have here? Well, I'm glad you asked. These small, to be honest, pain in the neck cables are the, and I can't even hold on to them, power switch, hard drive light, reswitch, reset switch, and power LED. Earlier, I showed you a handy installation tool that came with the motherboard. All this is an extension. It doesn't do anything and you don't have to use it. But the convenience is that you can plug these miscellaneous cables into this while reading the labels that's printed on the side of this easily, and then you insert this entire thing onto your motherboard. You can absolutely one at a time put these cables on your motherboard, but it can be difficult in a confined space, and this is really handy. I will use this. I'll show you what that looks like later. But the first thing we need to do is to move these out of the way, and so all I'm going to do is tuck them behind the drive tray just to push them aside out of the way. Now, hang on, don't put your motherboard in yet. We have a cable here that we want to move out of the way. Now, this is already twist tied, but this is not a serious cable because this is a very low voltage cable, so I'm going to leave it the way it is. This provides power to this big 140 millimeter exhaust fan. So all I'm going to do at the moment is just stick it there in the fan. No, we won't leave it there, to get that out of the way, because we need access to what's underneath. What's underneath, I will show you by lifting this up. That is where the I/O shield goes. That is where all your ports go out of the back of the system. For those curious, that's where the power supply goes. This is where your video card goes. We'll show all that, don't worry. I/O shield, let me grab the I/O shield. This provides protection for all of your I/O ports. It's just in plastic. We want to open that up. There is protection on this. It is foam with a metal shield on it, so you definitely want to make sure that you use it. I'll set that plastic aside. This is really nice. This is screen printed. I don't know if you can see it depending upon lights and reflection. I'll see if I can angle it. There we go. If I bring it closer, the camera may or may not focus. Yeah, it's complaining. Okay, there we go. But basically, this provides all the ports and it labels them. You've got your USB BIOS flashback switch, your PS2 plugs, your network cables, audio cables, etc. You want to make sure you install this in the correct orientation because it actually will install upside down if you do it. Just keep in mind that generally all of the bottom ports need to go towards the bottom or the back end of the case. There is a ridge. If this films, this snaps into place. There's no screws, there's nothing to do, it just snaps into place. It is a pressure snap. Let's see if I can film this in reverse for you. Do you see that coming through? All we're going to do is I'm going to put the bottom lip against the case first. This is challenging doing it from this angle, but we'll see what I can do. Can I push that in? There we go. There we go. Is that in firmly? Yes. Make sure all four corners snap in completely. Our I/O shield is now installed. Each motherboard comes with one of these. If you ever replace your motherboard, you'll have to replace this. You would simply push in on these edges and it would pop right out, no problem. Once the motherboard's in place, it'll apply pressure on it. It will never ever move. Now, if you look at the back of the case itself, you will see that we already have standoffs. Some cheaper cases make you install these yourself, but this is a premium high quality case. It should be for $130. We already have posts installed for our motherboard. Now, one thing I'm going to do is take a look at the motherboard and I'm going to compare post, post, there's a hole here, another post, another one, there we go. There's a peg here which will go through this hole. I'm just verifying. There's a post there. There we go. And then 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. It couldn't get any easier than that. When installing this, you push these actually will stick through the holes on the I/O shield. So it actually doesn't go straight down. It goes at an angle. With this fan in the way, I suppose I could take the fan out to make it a little easier to see, but it'll be obvious when you're doing it. Basically, you come in at an angle and push this and your audio ports through the holes in the I/O shield so that they're sticking just slightly out of the I/O shield, and then all of the holes on the motherboard should line up with the posts. In this particular case, this right here is not actually a screw hole. We'll screw screws into the other holes. This is a peg that will stick through here and will help hold the board in place. This is nice because it keeps the motherboard from shifting. So very carefully, if I can stay out of the camera while doing this, I'm going to push those through. And did I get it? I did. How easy was that? Did that look easy? It really was. Basically, it just comes down to going it at an angle and continually rotating it flat as you push the holes through. This peg is sticking through this hole right here. We'll put screws in the others, but I love this case because this peg is holding the motherboard in place. In other cases that don't have it, the motherboard would be shifting sideways and you'd have to hold it and turn it, and it's a big pain in the neck. Do you remember this bag of parts that we pulled earlier out of one of the drive trays and then the cardboard box? I'll bet you if we open this, we are going to find some screws. Oh, look at this. This is nice. It's been a year and a half since I've built in one of these cases. I own 2 of these cases at home in other computers. This case didn't come out last week, but frankly, it's such a good case they keep selling it. I forgot they came with a couple of zip ties, which you may actually be enough if you don't want to buy any. What else is in here? Screws. These look like... I'm having to look at the screws. Those might be motherboard screws. I'll show you what they look like in a second. Hey, drive screws. That's nice. Ooh, lots of screws. Look how many screws this case comes with. If you don't have a lot of screws, well, now you do. You have a lot of different screws for a lot of different devices. Even more screws. Screws for, I think, fans. And then, check this out. One more post in the event you need to use, I don't know why you would need another post, but they provide you with one extra one, just in case. So that first bag that I grabbed, and I'm going to show you what these look like up close, don't worry. All right, so I've taken these screws out. I'm going to attempt to get the camera to show you the screw. Because of the focusing issues, it may not. However, here's a simple test. They provided you with an extra post. Does it screw in? Yep, screws in perfectly. So you can test it on the spare post. So if you want to know whether you got the correct screw, use the spare post they provided. Don't do it over the case like I am. I'm doing this so you can see it when I film it. Do it off to the side. Don't let parts drop into your system. Now, I highly recommend that you have a screwdriver with a magnetic bit. Why? That's why. It'll hold on to it. All we have to do is screw these in. I am not going to tighten it until I put them all in, so in case the motherboard needs to shift slightly. Notice that I don't have to hold the screw on. The magnetic bit does it for me. Very handy to have. There we go. I'm not tightening these because I'm just making sure that all the screw holes are lined up. There we go. Make sure you don't cross thread the screws. And this one needs to be shifted just slightly. There we go. That particular screw was trying to go in at an angle, so when you screw it down, they screw in very easily. If you find you're having to use a lot of force, you probably have a cross-threaded screw. Take it out, try again. These don't require any force at all. This is fingertip force. Just, I'm using a couple of fingers. Note, do not use power tools when building a computer. Don't use an electric screwdriver, an electric drill. Use a manual screwdriver. You want to feel the force you're using. You never want to use power tools of any kind when building a computer. There's no need. Nothing in building a computer requires a power tool. Furthermore, a power tool runs the risk of creating static electricity on the end of the bit. Probably not, but I wouldn't chance it, so don't use them. I'm just using finger pressure. I know I'm screwing this in, it's not very exciting, but this is the kind of thing that is so important and gets glossed over in so many build videos, because I think a lot of people who build computers regularly, and I've built more computers than I can count, go, well, it's screwing it in. Why do you need to show that? Yeah, it's important. If this isn't done right, if these aren't mounted properly, if you cross-thread the screws, if you miss one, your whole computer's messed up. Don't do that. All right, so I now have one in every hole. Now there's no screw here because that is just a post that sticks up to hold the board in place. I really like that feature. I'm now going to go back and I'm going to tighten these, but I'm not twisting. I'm just using enough pressure to make sure it not goes anywhere. This isn't going anywhere. Just enough pressure to make it finger tight. Now for anybody wondering why I installed the RAM first, I'm going to show you. I didn't used to, but I started doing it a while ago. When you install the RAM, when the board is on top of your cardboard box, the entire board is supported evenly by the box. When you install the RAM here, the board is lifted off and supported only on these points, and when you push down, you're actually flexing the board. Why put any more flex on the board than is necessary? So I install the RAM before I put it in the machine, and of course it's easier to show you in a build video. Our CPU is now installed, check. Our RAM is installed successfully in all the gray slots, check. Our motherboard is installed, and I've made sure that each of the screws is installed and they are finger tight, check. While we're here, this is the opportunity to plug in the fan that is on the back of the case. Now, it has got a 3-prong plug on it. This is a 140mm exhaust fan that will take heat from this area of the machine, exhausting it out the back. There are multiple fan connectors on this motherboard. There are 2 white high amperage fans up here designed for the water pump and for the CPU fan. ASUS knows that virtually everybody installing this motherboard is going to use a water pump, and frankly, you should be using a water pump. It's labeled water pump right on the board. There's an additional fan connector right down here next to the memory. There is another one, a black one right here, and there are 2 on the side of the case over here. Now we have 2 fans in the front of the case, and they'll be plugged into the motherboard on this side. The water pump plug here will be for the pump itself, and then the next 2 fans will be the 2 120mm exhaust fans that will be on the top of the case. So I'm going to plug this exhaust fan into this plug right here. And all it does is, this is hard to film because of its location. You notice I left this twist tied. The reason I'm leaving this twist tied is because otherwise you just have to retie it. It is almost the perfect length, and it stays right out of the way. That's never going to bother anybody. There is a guide on each of these plugs so you can only install them one way. So that is our rear fan successfully installed. The next thing we're going to go ahead and plug in is our front cables. This entire collection of cables that you saw earlier. Why? It gets them out of the way, and once you start putting a lot of things in the case, it can be challenging to get them into your machine successfully. The first thing I'm going to show you is this. I'm going to open this up. There are tear tabs on either side. Take it out of its plastic container. Again, this doesn't do anything other than pass through the connections. Let me zoom in the camera. And here we are zoomed in. Now, if you look on this, there's just plugs here letting you know hard drive LED, power LED, power switch, ground, speaker, which we don't have a speaker in the case. All we're going to do here is we are going to connect, for example, without twisting them up too much, I'll take one. This is the hard drive LED. So we're going to look on here and see hard drive LED. We will plug that in just like so. That is all there is to it. I'll take the next one, and this one says power LED plus and minus. Power LED plus and minus. It doesn't get any easier than that. So I will plug the minus into the minus. If I can get it onto the prong, there we go. And then I will plug the plus into the plus. Now these plugs you can easily put directly onto the motherboard and they go right down here. But why you're fighting and trying to read it on there? That's entirely too much work. If I wanted to work that hard, well, I wouldn't work on computers. So we're just going to push that on. There we go. We're going to take our next one, and this one says power switch. If I turned this over, ground, power, here we go, power switch. So we'll plug our power switch in. And then we take our last one, and this one says reset switch. And that one is going to go right here, reset. This is much easier to do than trying to mess around with plugging them there. In addition, you cannot install this backwards. They have blocked off the holes that the system doesn't use, and the missing pins are on the board. And so all you have to do at this point, I'm going to bring these cables over here out of the way. All you have to do is line up the missing pins directly onto the end of the motherboard, and it would just slide right into place, just like so. You will see 2 pins off the end, at least I do. It's okay, because those pins aren't being used by any of these plugs, so it doesn't matter. So if you're confused by the fact that the connector does not actually use, the connector doesn't cover all the pins, that's okay. You should have 2 on the end of the board that are still exposed. Our front cables are now plugged in. Hopefully at some point Intel or case manufacturers or motherboard manufacturers figure out a way to do that nicer. I am actually at this point going to take the opportunity to take one of these zip ties. I'm going to take these cables. I am going to loop this around. I'm going to tie these off to force them to stay shorter so that they don't get in the way. And we will push this through. Hang on, let me turn it around the correct way. There we go. You will notice that it no longer has the ability to flail around. In my kit of tools, one of the handy things that I have is a set of cutters. You can of course use scissors, but these are quite handy to trim off the excess pieces. Make sure you trim off the excess pieces. So that is how we install our front panel switches, just like so, and those won't bother anybody. What about the rest of the cables? Let's go ahead and show you that now, shall we? We are going to connect the front USB 3 port, and we are going to put those right here, just like so. Now you may see this very large cable. Not to worry, we can pull this through and we'll tie it off in the back. This is our USB 2 cable, which we will not be using, and I'm going to push just a little bit of that through because we are going to pull that through completely and tie it off somewhere in the back because I'm not going to use it. We have our HD audio. Do we care? Well, that depends. Do you want the microphone and headphone jacks on the front of your case to work? I do. And so that's going to go right over here. There is one plug blocked, so it makes it easy to line up, and you cannot install it the wrong way by mistake. And it is a different blocked plug than the USB 2 connector, so you cannot accidentally put it in the wrong connector. That is really handy. This needs to be tied down. I'll probably tie it off in a tie-off point there at some point, but I'll leave that for the moment. I have now zoomed the camera back out so you can see the entire system. The next thing we want to install is our power supply. I have got our Corsair AX1200i power supply. Nice big fan. The fan goes down because the fan actually sucks air in from the bottom of the case and blows it out the back, so the fan's airflow and the fan's cooling is completely separate from the system. On the end of this power supply, there are a lot of plugs. You do not have to use all of these. The COM Connect is the Corsair link that I was mentioning before. This allows our system to, do I have that cable over here? This is the Corsair link. There is the USB, sorry, it's long. There's the USB 2 connector on one end, and then here is the COM link on the other end, if it will cooperate, there we go, that will plug in right there. The rest of the cables plug in to one of the various spots. This particular cable, for example, plugs into these 2 connectors right here and provides the main power for the motherboard. Your serial ATA connectors for your hard drives and SSDs plug in over here, and then this is your PCI Express and 4x4 CPU connectors down here for video card and motherboard power. Now, you have 2 ways you can do this. The first thing you can do is you can install this in place without plugging anything in. The problem then is you have to try to find the correct plug to plug everything into while it's currently sitting in your case on the side. I think that's a challenge. Furthermore, let me show you something to make your life easier. Let me set this right over here on the side. Actually, I'll put it sideways. Drive tray. Let's get this drive tray out of the way to provide plenty of room for our cables. We can put it back in later. Let me grab my screwdriver. There are 2 screws on the bottom of your drive tray. Furthermore, you don't have to have the drive tray there. Once those 2 screws are undone, it slides out that easily. There are rails on the bottom. It can be installed there. It can be installed on top of this drive tray and the 2 screws screwed in here, leaving more room free. Furthermore, you can buy an additional drive tray and stack it up here. In fact, you could put more drives in here than would be even reasonable, but you can certainly add additional drive trays. These are either $10 or $15 directly on Corsair's site. I don't remember what they cost exactly, but it's somewhere between $10 and $15. You can buy additional 3-drive trays if you wish to have more drives in your system. But I'm going to leave this aside for the moment because it frees up room and makes your computer much easier to work in. So without being able to remove the drive tray, I would recommend installing these cables first because at an angle it's hard to get to. But with the drive tray out of the way, it's not hard at all. So what we're going to do is put our power supply down here, and it does touch the back of your computer right here and fill the hole. There is also a piece of metal here that keeps it from moving up and flopping about. There are 4 screws that go into the back of the case, and those 4 screws are right over here. Your power supply should generally come with screws, and mine does. The case often comes with screws as well, and in this case did come with plenty of extra screws to use. So there are 4 screws to put in the side here. The holes line up. You can't possibly mess this up. I would turn it vertical, but in this case, the challenge to turning it vertical is on the power supply slides. This is much easier to do when the whole unit is laying on its side. So with our power supply successfully screwed in, it's time to start attaching some cables. The first cable you want to attach, the big one that you want to put in without anything else in the system, is the main system power cable. This one. Now, of course, the process for this will be a little bit different depending on what power supply you have. But even if you get, say, an HX850 power supply from Corsair or an EVGA B2 Gold power supply, 850 watt, those generally tend to be modular. They'll have separate cables as well. So the separate cables is not exclusive to the AX1200, which of course is a very expensive power supply. There are, on this particular set of cables, there's 2 on one end, 1 on the other. This plugs into the big 24-pin connector on the motherboard, and all that happens here is we install these on the back, and it goes like, hang on, I've got to get this correct. So those install into the 2 ports on the top of the power supply, and then this installs onto the motherboard, all 24 pins, and the spring tab, the release tab if you ever need to take it off, goes towards the outside, towards the front of the case. I recommend, this cable is so big and so thick, put your fingers under the board to support it to reduce the risk of cracking the board because it takes a lot of force to push it down. There we go. I don't like using the word force in a computer, but unfortunately this cable is an old design and it generally sometimes can take a good amount of force to push down onto the board. So that is our main cable. Now we will tie that off or secure it later, but for the moment, because it's our biggest cable, we install that first. The next thing we need to do is install our CPU power connectors up here. This provides mainboard power, this provides power to our CPUs, and plugs in to the power supply. So I have 2 of these cables, and this is one of the reasons why, even though this system could technically run on a 500 or 600 watt power supply, depending on what video card you put in, you actually need a fairly good power supply because you need 2 CPU power cables, and most basic power supplies will not come with this. Generally, somewhere between the 750 to 850 watt range is where you'll start to see 2 of these, and it needs to be a newer power supply because the older ones would not have had it. Now the first one is going to be fairly straightforward. Let me undo this twist tie. On one end, it is labeled, if you can read that, this is labeled TXM-HX-AXI only. This is the part that plugs into the power supply. It looks very similar to the other end, which says CPU. Now, 8 pins. You might say, wait a minute, one of those is 8, one of those is 4. Not to worry, I'll cover that in just a minute. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to plug one of these ends into the power supply, and I'm going to pick the furthest down plug I can take in order to route it to the top of the system. So with that end plugged into the power supply, this end plugs into the socket, and it plugs in, rounded end down, just like so. Make sure that you plug it in far enough that the tab pops in, because there's a little latch on the side it will connect to. This should not be sticking out. This should be even. So this cord I will wrap around this way, and again we'll tie all that off later. Let's take a look at the other one. Again, they both look very similar. One end says the power supply name, the other end says CPU. Not to worry, this actually disconnects into 2 halves. There we go. 2 halves. We are only going to use 1 half of it. They are keyed differently. You cannot accidentally plug the wrong one into this hole. Now, one of the questions somebody may ask is, what if I have a power supply that doesn't have 2 CPU power cables? What if I only have the one? Will the system work with only 1 cable plugged in? Yes, but probably not overclocked, which defeats the point. If you're spending this much money on a computer and your power supply doesn't have both of these, replace the power supply. No, you don't have to spend $310, but you should spend at least $120 or so for a Corsair for an EVGA 850 watt gold modular power supply is about $120 or so. By splitting those apart, I'm going to plug one end down on the bottom. With one end plugged on the bottom, I am now going to take one of these ends, and it is going to be this one. You can actually see the shapes are different. By just looking at the shape of the plug, I can see which one plugs in, and you'll be able to see it too. And it snaps right in. Again, these just route around the side, and yes, again, we will tie these off later, but let's get everything installed before we tie anything off. So, just to summarize, motherboard installed, CPU installed, RAM installed, motherboard screwed in, front connectors plugged in, front audio connected, plugged in, USB 3 plugged in, we're not using the USB 2. Our power supplies installed. The main motherboard power and the CPU power for the motherboard are installed from the power supply, and our exhaust fan is currently installed, plugged in. Let's go ahead and do the front fans. While we're here, these will have to be untied, and that is now untied. This is for the top front fan. I am going to plug this, routing it under all of these cables, into the chassis fan connector on the motherboard, which is located right here. If you have a different motherboard than this, the positioning might be slightly different, but if it fits, it's the right one. Now we have to get our second fan, which is actually behind this. In fact, I will go ahead and take this out so you can see that. With that unscrewed, this simply slides right out. Very modular case. I've mentioned in the previous videos how much I love this case. It is so easy to work with. You can now see the power cable for the second front fan. I have removed the twist tie to that, and it will plug into the motherboard right there. Now again, this is loose. I will tie it off, but we're going to have more cables, so I don't want to tie anything more just yet, but there is that to consider. With both front fans plugged in, I'm going to reinstall the drive trays. With the drive trays successfully reinstalled, we now have to make a decision on what order we're going to install the rest of our components. Here's why I bring this up. The cables and both the data and power for the drives will be on the back of the system. We also have the drive mounts for the solid-state drives in the back, which happen to be in a similar location to the hard drives. It will be easier to install the hard drive cables first because I can remove the trays for the solid state drives and get them out of the way, install the cables for the hard drives, and then we can put the SSDs in last. Now there is a large hole down here I want to draw your attention to, and if I leave a hard drive tray here, if I move this tray from here to here, it's much easier to get access to. But note, if we put the drive tray here, these cables have to be pushed all the way over. There is a benefit to moving the drive tray from its standard configuration over here in order to leave plenty of room for all these cables because we're going to have more cables. If you don't install lots of hard drives, maybe you're only going to put 1, 2, or 3 drives. Take a tray out and leave it out if you want to. There's no need to put it in if you don't want, or just move it up here for safekeeping. So what we're going to do now is install our hard drives. This is the easiest part of the installation. We have got our hard drives here. I am going to take them out of the protective packaging. No, you should not do this over the computer, but I'm doing it because I'm filming it. I know I probably say that a lot, but again, camera, filming. This is an 8 terabyte Seagate drive. There is virtually nothing on the back except a small circuit board, and then we have our power and data ports. Now I'm going to install these in the 4 lower drive trays. Why? Because at some point in the future I'm likely to add 2 more, and having them at the top should make it easier to access them. Just push these in, they slide out, they're completely toolless. Don't install it this way, you need the data and power ports in the back. As for how to install them, these just bend out a bit and the pins snap right in. That's all there is to it. And then the tray slides in like so, and the hard drive is installed. How does it get any easier than that? We'll take our next drive, take it out of the anti-static bag. Again, nothing on the back, ports here. We take our tray. Remember to install the ports on the back. And we will snap it in place. Done. Easiest hard drive installation ever. Our hard drives are now successfully installed, all 4 of them, with 2 open bays for future expansion. And yes, there is room here to install another drive tray here if you wish to add even more drives in the future. But for now, I'm going to leave it the way it is. What we need at this point is serial ATA power cables, which conveniently come 4 to a plug. On one end of this is a 6-pin connector which plugs into the power supply, and on the other end we have 4 power cables. Now, let's think about future expansion. Do we wish to go ahead and run an extra cable? Now there's 4 connectors here, 4 hard drives, 4 connectors. What would power the additional 2 drives that I plan to add in the future, much less 2 more in additional bays? No worries. I'm going to add another one right now that will not connect to anything. Why? Because this way I don't have to go hunting for it in 6 months or a year when I know I'm going to end up using it. I will go ahead and have it plugged in. I will have it run through this hole, tucked in the back. I will leave it tied up, not connected to anything, available for future use. If you think you might add more drives in the future, connect an extra one, put it through the hole in the back. If you put a drive tray here, there's grommets here you can run the connector through. It's just easier to do this for the future. So, as for power, you can run the power through the hole behind the case and into the drives. I'm not going to do that. And the reason for that is because the SSD trays are behind there and they will be blocking it, and it's much easier to actually just run it behind the drive trays. So what I'll be doing here is I will plug this into an available port in the bottom. There we go. And then I'm just going to lay it right here. And you'll see why in just a minute when I have this turned over so we can see the back. I'm going to show you how we're going to plug these cables in. We now have the computer case turned over on its back. So this is the back side of the case, this is the back of the motherboard, and here are all the toolless drive trays for our solid state drives. But we're not worried about those right now. What we are concerned about is plugging in all the cables for our hard drives. First things first, I mentioned before that I was going to pull this through. This is that USB 2 cable, which I will not be using. I'm just going to set that aside for just a moment. The second thing I'm going to pull through is the cables for the USB 3. There we go. I'm taking the tension out. We will tie these up in a minute, but what I want to do is leave as little cable on the other side of this case as possible to leave all the airflow open for our graphics card and our motherboard. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these toolless trays. They come out as easy as that. You simply pull this in and they come straight off. Don't worry, we'll reinstall these later with our SSDs. But for the moment, I'm simply getting them out of the way, and I will place them over here where they'll not be in our way. You can now see our hard drives easily accessible. You can see how these cables would be blocked by the SSDs installed here. This wire is the wire from the fan on the front of the case. We're simply going to push it down here out of the way. This is the cable I installed earlier. This is our power cable for these drives. What I'm going to do is I need it routed. There we go. It's actually going to come not through here. You could bring it through here. The problem with doing so is the SSD then gets in the way. Now, if you are not installing as many SSDs as I am, then you do have the option of maybe removing one of these trays and leaving it out, and then you have room to come around the corner. Instead, I'm going to bring it between the back plate and the drives so that it doesn't get in the way of our solid state drives. These power cables are keyed. There is an L shape, if the camera will pick it up at this distance, and then there's an L shape on the drives. It's pretty straightforward. I am simply going to install these in a chain. And yes, you do have to bend the cable just a little bit. We now have our 4 data cables, our power cables installed in the back of each one of our drives. Now we need data cables. Not to worry, the motherboard comes with 4 serial ATA data cables. Now I'm going to need more than this, and I do have more, but for the moment I'm going to take the 4 that the system came with. Oh, that came open kind of easily. On these cables, again, they have an L shape. So they go in a certain way, and I'm going to plug that in. And I'm not routing them through here. Instead, I'm routing them through the side, and we'll connect those in just a minute. Note that when you install these, there is in fact a clip that will snap into place when they are installed. And then I'm just going to take these cables and run them through the side here. It is worth noting that these power cables will require a bend. It is not going to matter. There's actually not that much power running through them. Ideally, we would have a slightly flatter cable, but it is what it is. My own system at home is 3 years old and works just fine the same way. So these will all be pressed flat once the SSDs are installed. We are now going to turn the computer over, and I'll show you the plugging in of those cables in the front of the machine. The system is now turned facing right side up again. We've got our drives over here, and we have our 4 data cables that were plugged into the drives. Now, there are 10 serial ATA ports that you can plug into. There are 2 connectors here, there are 4 connectors here, and 4 connectors here. Please note, if you plan to use the Intel RAID software RAID that is built into the chipset, you must plug the drives into these 2 ports and these 4 ports. These last 4 ports do not work with the integrated RAID technology that's noted in the user manual. Now, if you have a different motherboard, that may be different. But if you want to set up a RAID 0, 1, 5, or 10 in the BIOS, then they have to be plugged into these 6 ports. Now, I'm using Windows storage spaces, so it doesn't make any difference where I plug them in. So I'm going to plug them in to these 4 ports here to put them all together. And these plug in very simply, just like so. And no, it does not really matter which order you plug them in because they're just seen by the computer and by Windows as individual drives, and then Windows storage spaces will combine them into a single 32 terabyte array with parity, giving me approximately 24 terabytes of usable space, and then I can suffer the failure, knock on wood, of a drive and not lose any data. I just thought of something while we're sitting here, completely random point. This motherboard has got a protective cover over the chipset. It is plastic, and I just remembered I didn't remove it earlier, so this is as good a time as any. Make sure you remove the plastic off of the chipset itself and discard that. It's just a very thin layer, but it would trap heat. You don't want to leave heat in there. So now, let's summarize where we're at. CPU installed, RAM installed, motherboard installed. All three case fans are plugged into the motherboard. Power is provided to both the CPU and the motherboard from the power supply. The power supply is installed. We have our front panel connectors, our front USB connector, our front headphone and microphone jack connected. We have got our 4 hard drives connected to both power, connected to the power supply, and data plugged into the motherboard. We are doing really, really well. What's next? Solid state drives, but we're not doing those next. We're going to do the fun one. This, side note, just cable management issue. I'm going to take this connector off and I'm going to put this cable behind it because I am ultimately going to run a tie through here and tie off the front panel audio connector because this keeps moving around and you don't want this to move. So I'm going to end up tying this. I'll show you that in a minute. But we're going to do this one. I'm kind of excited about this one. I haven't used this one yet. The Samsung 950 Pro NVMe solid state drive, which is, of course, in a very sealed box. And so now with the box cut open, I can open it. For as expensive as this is, there's really not much to it. It's smaller than a stick of RAM. However, it provides both tremendous performance as well as excellent endurance. Oh, look at that. It just comes right out. It doesn't even snap into place. Look how thin that is. That is a 512 gigabyte NVMe solid state drive, up to 2.5 gigabytes per second read speed, 1.5 gigabyte per second write speed. That's incredible. Now, it mounts to the M2 slot on the motherboard. Remember the screw I mentioned at the very beginning you needed to keep? Well, there's actually 2 items in here. The first item, let me open this. The first item is a post. The second item is the screw. The post is extremely straightforward. Screw it into the 3rd screw hole on the motherboard. And you can just do this with your fingers. There's no need to use a tool for this. You can, but you don't need to. There we go. So we have plugged that into the 3rd screw hole on the motherboard. We then take our 950 Pro and we insert it into the M2 slot, and it rests just like that. The golden fingers will disappear. If they don't disappear, then you haven't inserted enough. It will click into place, and then your traditional screwdriver is much, much too big for this screw. You will just damage this screw. That is why my handy VisionTech toolkit includes much smaller screwdrivers. And this is exactly why you need them. It is worth noting that the SSD does not come with the post or the screw. If you lose the post and the screw from the motherboard, you can't install that without buying another one. Now you can buy those individually, but why do that? If you buy a motherboard and you're not currently planning to install an NVMe SSD, make sure that you save the screw and the post in case you decide to in the future. Further note, the Z170 motherboards, and I do believe the Z97 boards that have an M2 slot, this is called an M2 slot, do support both NVMe SSDs as well as serial ATA SSDs, such as the 850 EVO. My understanding is the X99 platform does not. It only supports NVMe. If you try to install an 850 Evo into the X99 board, my understanding is it will not work. It's possible there's one that does, but from reading the forums and reading the tech help section of ASUS's website, only an NVMe SSD is going to work in the X99-A2 motherboard. Side note, while the 950 Pro on the day I'm filming this is the latest and greatest SSD in existence, the 960 Pro and the 960 Evo are both coming very, very soon. If you're watching this video in October or November or later of 2016, the 960 Pro and the 960 Evo may be out. If they are, and those are both NVMe drives, you should be able to install those as well. You just can't put an 850 Evo in here. Okay, enough of that. That's it. That's installed. That is the easiest SSD installation ever. Now we are going to install our solid state drives. We need to add one more of these cables for power to our solid state drives. And because of the distance of each of these trays in the back of the case, these are almost certainly not going to be close enough to connect all the drives. It's not going to reach because they have to be turned. So, because of that, we need another one. And I mentioned earlier we're going to install one more for hard drives, and look at that, we have plenty. One of the benefits of going with a high-end power supply is you have all the cables in the world you need to plug everything in. So first things first, let me plug this in right down. So that is one cable. This I will run through the hole in the back because it's going to our SSDs. I'm going to unscrew another one. This also will be plugged in to the power supply. And it also will be run to the back because we're going to need it for our SSDs. Now this is our third one. What's this doing? Okay, I just have to undo this enough to disconnect this, and then I'm going to retie it. I mentioned I'm connecting one more cable because I fully expect to need it in the future for future hard drive expansion, and I don't want to have to mess around with it in the future. So I am plugging that right here, and I'm going to run it through the hole, and I will tie it off in the back, not connected to anything, so that it's available for future expansion, so I'm not hunting down cords in the future. Let's turn this case over and I'll show you the installation of the SSDs. And now we have the case turned back on its back side. I mentioned tying this off. There are handy tie loops on the back of this case. I'm going to take one of the included zip ties. I'm going to run this through one of this, and I am going to tie this cable off just like that. That's not going anywhere. I will take my handy cutters. I will cut off the extra unused end. There we go. Now, these are one-time use zip ties. If I ever want this off, I have to cut the zip tie. But, you know, that's why having plenty of zip ties is handy. But now I've got this cord sitting back here for the future, should I ever need it. These are the two power cords from earlier. I mentioned that you will need additional data cords, at least because the motherboard comes with 4 serial ATA data cables. You'll need more. Not to worry. These are a couple of dollars each. I bought these off of Newegg. Plenty of cables. So now we are going to install our solid state drives. You will see I've got red data cables here that I have gone ahead and opened from the packaging. Why red? Well, I actually own red and blue spare cables, and there are benefits to this. By using all black cables on the hard drive and all red cables on the SSD, when you look at the front of the system and what's plugged into the motherboard, it's fairly easy to figure out what is an SSD data cable and what is a hard drive cable. If you want to separate it even further, you can get these in basically every color of the rainbow. So you can get yellow, blue, orange, and probably even fuchsia. That's an inside joke for those of you who watch my channel a lot. The first SSD we're going to install is the SanDisk Ultra 2 960 gig SSD. This box is actually completely sealed, and so you have to destroy it to open it. This is not something I can just cut the edge and take it out and keep a nice pretty box, I'm afraid. The interesting thing about these SSDs is there's really not much to them. It's really just flash memory. And now it's open. So there is our SanDisk Ultra 2 solid state drive. It's not very fancy, there's not much to it. So we're going to take one of our toolless 3.5-inch drive trays and be aware of how these install, because it will affect, if I can mount it, there we go. I'm going to put one in so that you can get an idea of how these install. This tab simply moves out of the way and allows you to install it. That's it. That's all it takes to install. Now, if you take a look, you will see that the SSD is allowed to flex. And the reason for that is because I did not install this. This is a spacer. This is really a 7mm thick drive, and these trays take 9.5mm drives. You can absolutely, depending on the SSD you have, there's 2 sticker strips on the back here. Just peel these off. You would put this right on there just like that, and you increase the thickness so it doesn't move around. And just for the sake of demonstration, I will put it on. I normally wouldn't bother because this is flash memory and it does not matter. But I'm doing a video, so I'll show you what it looks like. Why not? All this does is makes the drive 2.5mm taller. Just press that into place. And then pull our tab aside, slide the drive in, and now it fits without any motion. Does it matter? No, not really. But if that sort of thing matters to you, then by all means. Let's go ahead and install our other drives. This time we have our ADATA, our SP550 960 gig drive. Same thing, 7mm thick, and again, same thing, they provided us with a spacer. Will I install it? Sure, why not? We're doing a video. I might as well. It really is. Well, if you line it up correctly, that is. That's all there is to it. Take another one of our toolless trays. In fact, this time, we'll mount it just like so. And we now have 2 960 gig SSDs installed. How about we do another one, shall we? So this Crucial MX300 is a 750 gigabyte solid state drive. It is a brand new release from Crucial, and I am looking forward to testing this because this will be my first MX300. Same thing again. Spacer. Yeah, sure, why not? We'll go ahead and install it. So there is our spacer installed on the drive. Again, what would happen if you did not install these spacers on the drive? Absolutely nothing. These are flash memory. There's no moving parts. They wouldn't care. They would work exactly the same either way. It would honestly not make any difference whatsoever. Last but not least, we have our 1 terabyte 850 EVO. This drive is more expensive than the 960 gig SanDisk or the ADATA, but it is faster, much faster, worth the money if you're building a premium system like this. If you don't put in an NVMe SSD, I strongly suggest that your boot drive be an 850 EVO. If a terabyte's too much, by all means, do 250 gigabytes or 500, but I would not skimp on the SSD on a system like this. In lesser systems, I have often recommended something like a SanDisk Ultra 2, an ADATA, a PNY drive. If you're building a $1,000 machine, if you're building an $800, $1,200 machine, sure, those are fine. For what this costs, there's no excuse to have anything less than at least an 850 EVO in here. So, this drive is black and not fancy at all, and there is no spacer. So we will take our tray and I will mount it. With our last tray in place, we take our 850 EVO 1 terabyte drive and put it into place. And no, there is not a spacer in the package, but it doesn't matter. Power cables. I mentioned that we've got 2 power cables sitting here. Why? Let me show you. I'm going to take the first one. These are keyed, and so they have to go in at an angle. And so you are going to have to apply some pressure and bend that a bit. There's just no way around the angling of it. You're going to have to apply some pressure to stick that on the drive. Will it reach the next one? Not really. See? It just doesn't reach. Now, a different power supply with different cables may not have this problem. But in this case, I'm going to skip. Actually, you know what I may do? I may use the end one. And I'll show you why in a second. It gives me less to tie off. I do have this middle piece, but I'll be able to tie that off in a minute. I'll take the other cable, and I'll go ahead and connect the end one right here. Oh, that came off. And then I will connect, do I want to do this one? Nope, I'll go ahead and give myself the whole thing. How you cable manage depends entirely upon what you're installing. Do I think most of you are going to install all this? No. I have very specific needs for this. This is a multifunction machine that's going to do a lot of different things, not just for my YouTube channel, but for me personally and for my other business. So that's why this is here. But if you need such a system, 4 SSDs plus the 5th in the motherboard plus all the hard drives, I did say $4,000 ultimate system build, didn't I? Well, yes, you can spend more money. I mean, I could have all 4 terabyte 850 EVOs here and spend $6,000 on drives, but I don't need that much space. That would be crazy. I'll tie this off in a minute. Now, data cables. These, it does not matter which end you plug into which. So we are going to plug each of these in, and then I'll run them all through at the same time. So I now have my 4 serial ATA cables, and I'm going to run them through this rubber grommet, depending on how you pronounce that. Now, while I have the system on this side, I want to think about cable management. Can you just leave all this sitting here? Yes, but it's kind of a mess. Let's do some cable management. I'm going to take another one of the free zip ties provided by the case. I haven't even gotten to my purchase zip ties yet, but we'll use those later, don't worry. Remember my handy USB 2 cable that I'm not going to be using because I don't have the plug on the motherboard? You remember these little ties on this end? I am actually going to take this and I'm going to loop it with the cables I pulled through from the back, and I'm going to loop it around again. That's not big enough. I'm not going to use the free zip tie for that. Time to break out the good stuff. And just for fun, no, that's not big enough. I was going to pull a lime green one out, but it's actually not quite long enough for what I want to do. Having long ones is handy. I am tying up all of these cables. I'm going to run the zip tie through the cable management hook in the back, around the cables, pull that nice and tight. Those are now not going anywhere. Okay, my loop may not be the prettiest loop in the world, but they will not rub. What you don't want is you don't want it rubbing against your motherboard. Very important. Don't leave cables back here that could hit your motherboard. Cut the end of that off. Now, what about these loose cables? Do these matter? Well, once you put the case on, the back cover on, they're not really going anywhere, but it's a matter of principle. You do what you want with your own system, but I am going to push these through to make sure I'm not using any more than I have to. I'm not going to tie the data and the power together in case I need to ever replace the cable, but what I am going to do is I'm going to tie these off. By the way, somebody is bound to say, shouldn't you wait to do cable management until you know the system is working? I have faith. I'm a believer. This is my way of demonstrating that I believe it's all going to work. Look how much nicer that is. We'll cut the end off. We'll take one more of our free zip ties. Yes, if you have never done this before, if you are more concerned about whether everything is going to plug in right or not, make sure we remember to plug our cable back in that I disconnected. Now again, somebody is bound to say, do you really want to zip tie everything and tie everything up before you know the system works? This is me having a faith and a positive attitude towards the future. If you've never done this before and you're afraid of missing a step or having a problem, okay, don't. Here's something to keep in mind. If you plug everything in and leave the cables loose, you definitely should at least tie this off. Don't leave a cable that long back here. But let's say you plug the machine in and it works. You have your shiny new computer ready to go. Are you then going to turn it right back off and open it back up and then cable manage? You know, you say you will you? I don't think I would. If I don't do it now, I'm frankly never going to. So I've got my extra power cable reserved for the future tied off. I've got all 4 of my serial ATA cables plugged in. I've got all these cables, the power cables plugged in. I've got them zip tied off, and then I've got the excess front panel cable zip tied as well, so it doesn't touch our motherboard. Let's flip this around and plug everything in, shall we? And we are now looking at the front of the case again. We have got our 4 red serial ATA cables that we ran through from the other side. There are several places you can plug these in. This particular motherboard has 10 serial ATA cable plugs. We're using 4 of them for the hard drives here. I mentioned before that 6 of the plugs work with Intel's RAID technology. That's the 6 gray plugs, the 2 up here in the front near the top, and then the 4 here. I'm going to leave these 2 empty. Why? Future hard drives. If I install 2 more hard drives here, those will be plugged in here, easy to access. Instead, I'm going to plug all of the serial ATA SSDs into the 4 black ports down here near the bottom. And there we have it, all 4 plugged in there. I trimmed that out because that's a bunch of cable management and cable plugs that you didn't need to see anyway. You plug them in, it's not that complicated. I did plug them in behind my big, thick power cord. The idea is to keep all the cables down and away from where our video card is ultimately going to go. It is finally time to do something about that front panel audio cable, which is just sitting there in the wind. I'm going to grab one of the zip ties, and I'm going to take it, and I'm going to zip tie it. These cable management rings actually run on the back. They're not really meant to be used in the front. I have zip tied it to one of the power cables for the hard drives. Now, I don't normally like tying such things together, but frankly, the power cable for the hard drive and the front audio cable are not high voltage devices. I'm not terribly worried about it. And it's just 2 of them here, but it forces this to stay away from all the other plugs and connectors. It is now time to install our liquid cooler on our CPU. But before you do this, some thought needs to be put into how the system is going to handle airflow. What happens next will depend upon what kind of liquid cooler, if any, you are installing. If you are installing a single fan cooler, such as the H60, H80, or H90 liquid coolers that have a single fan, my recommendation would be to install it on the top of the case in an exhaust airflow configuration. Here's why. There are 2 140 millimeter fans in the front pulling air into the case. There is one 140 millimeter fan here blowing air out of the case. If you add one more fan on a single radiator cooler blowing air up, you'll have 2 intake and 2 exhaust. It'll be a balanced system for smooth airflow. Note, because of the configuration of the power supply, the fan in the power supply does not substantially contribute to the cooling of the system because it pulls air in through the bottom and exhausts it out the back, and it's basically its own cooling. What about our current configuration? We are installing a 280 millimeter liquid cooler. What are we going to do? Okay, if I install that right here, there will be two 140 millimeter fans blowing air out of the top of the case, and an additional 140 millimeter blowing out the back, with only two fans blowing air inside. Now, if you do some quick math, you might discover something. 3 is greater than 2. Yes, I know, I stayed up late and went to night school for that. Joking aside, 3 fans exhausting air and 2 fans bringing air in is going to create a low pressure system inside the case. It's going to struggle to bring in enough air in order for these fans to work at maximum efficiency. So we have to change something. Well, we don't have to, but our cooling system will work better if we balance the number of intake and the number of exhaust fans. Here's what I'm going to do, and here's what I recommend you do if you're going to install either a 240 or 280 millimeter radiator into a system like this where you have this type of fan system. I am adding an additional fan. This did not come with the liquid cooler. This is an additional 140 millimeter Corsair fan, and I'm going to be installing it right here. Why? Let me show you what the top of this case looks like. We are now looking at the top of the case. On the top of the case, we have a very nice mesh radiator, which makes it look nice and allows airflow, while at the same time not being ugly with fans. This is magnetic, and it comes off that easily. So I'm going to set that aside. We have mounting holes here for 3 different either 120 millimeter or 140 millimeter fans. Our radiator is going to go right here, mounting into these holes. So we're going to use 2 of these slots for our exhaust. I am going to add 1 more here, exhausting air. So there will be 3 fans on the top of the case, all exhausting air up. Heat rises, so heat coming out of the case is a good thing. Now you might say, wait a minute, now you have 4 fans exhausting. No, we don't. We're going to reverse the rear fan and turn it into an intake. No, normally the top rear fan should not be an intake, but this is an exception because of the way we're designing it. Let's turn the case back on its side and I'll show you. Now that we're back on the side of the case, this fan will be reversed. You have to unscrew it from the back and physically turn it around. And this fan will now become an intake. We will now have 3 intakes and 3 exhaust. The 2 intakes in the front and the intake on the side, and then 3 exhaust fans on the top. These are quiet fans, don't worry. This fan will now bring in cool air and blow it across our RAM and our heatsink on the board, and will increase the static pressure inside the case, giving the top fans the air they need to cool the radiator and to give us maximum overclocking. You may not get as much of an overclock if you have a low pressure air system inside of your computer because you have fewer intake than exhaust fans, which is why we're going to be installing that extra fan in the system in addition to the 2 that came with the liquid cooler. First things first, you need your screwdriver. This is very simple. We are simply going to unscrew the 4 screws on the back of this case. This is as simple as disconnecting this and turning it around. No more, no less. Do be sure to catch it before you disconnect the last screw, because otherwise it will fall on your motherboard and you don't want to do that. So now we have our fan disconnected. This is quite simply a matter of turning it around. That's all. There's nothing else to it. It really is that simple. So I'm just going to line it back up with the holes, and I'm going to take my screws and screw it right into place. Because this side has never had the screws put into it, and you are actually screwing directly into plastic, it will take just a little bit of force. I don't like using the word force in computers, but you're actually carving grooves into the plastic. And so there'll be a little bit of resistance. Not a lot, but a little bit. And then once you've got all 4 in, Then go ahead and tighten them up. Not too tight. You'll break the plastic if you screw too tight. Just enough so it's not loose. Okay, so this is now an intake fan and will blow air into our system. Let me make sure that this cord is secure. It is. That's good. So we will be having 3 intake fans. I now have to add one more exhaust fan. This is a separate fan. These cost about $13 or $14, not very expensive, but you will get better overclocking out of your very expensive computer if you add another fan to create a balanced fan system. Note, the case actually comes with the screws for this. They're very, very thick threads, and the case came with 8 of these. So the case actually came with enough screws to add 2 more of these if you need them. Side note, when you're looking at a fan, make sure you check which way it's blowing. Simply look at the curve. Just remember that it looks like a scoop on one side and it looks like an outward curve on the other. So this is the part that we want on the inside of the case because it's going to blow air this direction, so we want it mounted this direction. Furthermore, you want to make sure to turn it in such a way that your plug can reach one of the power connectors on the motherboard. So I'm going to check that by just putting it where I plan to install it. I'll just hold it there for a second, and then I'll check to make sure that I can reach. And if you look, you'll see it doesn't quite reach. It's close, but it doesn't quite reach. That's why you want to check this before you start screwing things into your system. So we turn it one more time, and I'll line it up with the holes. And let's try this. Perfect. That reaches without any trouble. So now we are going to, I'll just set that down there. That's not going anywhere. Take my screwdriver and I'll see if I can hold this up to the camera and get it to see. That is the screw, if it's focusing, that you're going to use to screw the fan in. And there we have got our last screw in place. And we now have a 140mm fan that is exhausting air out the top that will be in front of our others, no problem. Note, if you install a fan here and you want to put something in all 3 drive bays, that fan is not going to get any airflow. You do have to take into account that the top 5¼ inch drive bay is right next to where that fan is. So if you're installing a DVD or Blu-ray drive, I am not, because frankly I don't use them anymore, but if you are, I would recommend installing it in one of the 2 lower positions to allow good airflow around that fan. If by chance you plan to install something in all 3 drive bays, well, that's another matter entirely, but that's a tight fit. So we take this power connector and we simply plug it into the slot on the motherboard. There we go. Now we've got all of our case fans done, it is time to do the liquid cooler. I know that seemed like a lot of talking. I realize that thinking about airflow in case fans isn't very sexy, it's not very much fun. But if you plan to overclock and if you're spending the kind of money that an X99 motherboard and an Enthusiast 6 or more core chip entails, then you really should put some thought into airflow. Have the same number of intake as well as exhaust fans. So now we have 3 intake, 3 exhaust fans, a balanced airflow system. We should have some really, really good cooling. Now, there's one more thing to think about. Push or pull. What is push or pull? Well, this is an interesting topic, and I'm going to bring the radiator over here to show it to you and talk about. Here is our Corsair radiator. Here's a fan. Now you're going to have 2 of them, but I'm just going to hold one because it's easier. Do you want the fan, let me turn it to the proper airflow direction. Do you want the fan pushing air through it, or do you want the fan pulling air through it? Push or pull. The airflow is in this direction out of the top of the case. The question simply is, how do you want the air to flow through the radiator? Well, I personally have not conducted extensive tests. I don't need to. Everyone's been doing this for years. There is no end of websites and videos that show various tests. In fact, even 4 years ago, Linus Tech Tips posted a video back when Linus was doing handheld shots at NCIX, and he talked about this very issue back then. Jay's Two Cents has talked about it. Basically, everybody has been talking about this, and in short, it doesn't make any difference. I'm going to take their word for it. I'm not going to test this myself. It's beyond the scope of my channel, and frankly, if Linus and Jay say it doesn't matter, then to me it doesn't matter. Shout out to both of them, by the way. I love their channels, and if you haven't subscribed to either one of them, you definitely should. So, I am going to mount this in a pull configuration. Why? Let me give one more shout out to Linus at Linus Tech Tips. His video from 4 years ago showed the problem with a push configuration: dust. This blows air onto the radiator and you end up with dust between the radiator and the fan. And he showed a 1-year-old liquid cooler caked in dust. He also showed a pull configuration that did not have dust all over it. To me, that basically sums up the correct installation, which is pull. So for cooling performance, it doesn't matter. For dust, pull is better. Now, what does pull mean? Pull means that the radiator needs to be below the fans. That means we need to install the fans first, and then we will screw the radiator onto the fans. So I'm going to set the radiator aside. I'm going to grab my fans. Now, we want to think about our cabling, because once we screw these in, we don't want to take them off again. Where are these going to plug? Well, that's the interesting thing. I was originally planning on plugging them into the motherboard, but on the end of the water block, you have got 3 plugs. The first is a serial ATA power connector, and we're going to have to get power to this. The second is 2 plugs for fans. These are for the 2 fans that will be plugged into the radiator. And then the third is to plug into the motherboard to let the motherboard know that a CPU fan is present. So we're going to plug the CPU fan into the plug on the motherboard that is marked CPU fan. The 2 fans plugged into the radiator will be plugged into the water block. This actually leaves us one additional open cooling plug on the case if we wanted to use it. However, I don't really have a place to put any other fans, so I won't be using it, but there is in case maybe you go with a different case. The 2 fans on the radiator plug in here. Note, on the less expensive liquid coolers such as the single fan H90, this isn't provided, and so the H90 actually uses 2 plugs on the motherboard, whereas the H110 uses 1. That's actually pretty cool, and I wasn't aware of that, so there you go. So there's 2 ways to mount your fans and your radiator to the top of the case. Corsair's normal recommendation is to put the radiator on the top and the fans in it. In fact, if you read their instruction manual, it says to use it as an air intake. But of course, I don't agree with that because it creates an unbalanced airflow system, but you can. Now, the instruction manual does not show a way to install the fans on the top and the radiator beneath it, but not to worry, it actually works just fine. What I've done is I've gone ahead and mounted the 2 fans here, but only using 2 screws per fan. I've mounted, and this was simply easier just to do it than talk to you about it. I've put the screws in on the bottom, holding it to the top of the case. Those are temporary screws which will be removed shortly. Those are these big thick screws which hold fans onto cases. They're only in there temporarily. I'll take them out in a minute. These very long screws that come with the liquid cooler, they are going through the top of the case using one of the included washers. So, put the washer on the long screw, and the washer will keep it from running through the top of the case. What do you get? Coming out the bottom of each fan is just enough screw to screw into the radiator and hold it on. But you got to do this in a multi-step process. Trying to hold 2 fans in place with loose screws and a radiator would be next to impossible, which is why I use the 2 temporary screws. Now, if you don't want to do this and you want to follow Corsair's method, you can by putting the radiator on the top and then the fans underneath it. But then the fans are blowing air through it if they're exhaust fans. And the problem with that is dust accumulation, and a little bit of work now will save a lot of dust trouble later. So, having inserted those screws, I am now going to take my 280 millimeter liquid cooler, and I am putting the hoses on this side. If you put them on this side, they'll run into that fan. They have to go on this side. In order to keep this from hitting anything, I'm going to be very careful and just set it over this way because I don't want to mess with it at the moment. So I'm being very careful just to put that where it's not going to move. Well, I'll put it there. It's not going to move. Okay. Take my screwdriver. I have to raise the radiator up and line it up with the fan. Now, this is a little bit tricky, and you may want to plan this out and think it through before you do it. I'm trying to avoid the fan blowing dust into the radiator and thus necessitate me taking it apart and cleaning it every year, which I would really rather not do. I would rather be able to take a can of compressed air and just blow the top of the case and be done with it. So I'm lifting the radiator up to line it with the fan, and I'm taking my screwdriver. Let me move there we go. Now you can see better. I'm taking my screwdriver with those very long screws, and I am, there we go. Once you get the first one done, it's a lot easier. There we go. See? Now it's not going to drop. This first screw is now holding the radiator in place. Now it's not secure, but we've got it. This next one, you just have to line it up, get it through both of the fan holes, and there it goes. Now I'm not screwing these in too tight because I got to do all of them. I will take one more and another washer, and I will come to the far end. It just takes a little bit of jiggling around till you find the screw hole. Once you've got the top 4 screws in, now you can start taking out the bottom temporary screws, which is what I'm doing right now. I had 4 temporary screws in the bottom just to hold the fans in place. It makes it so much easier to do this if you just use a couple of temporary screws in the bottom to hold the fans in place, which is what I'm taking out now. And now I just take my additional screws and I will do the bottom. And this is the final screw on the bottom. And so now I'm just going to go, now that I've got it all lined up properly, I'm just going to tighten. Not excessive force because you're screwing into the radiator. The fans actually are just being held on by pressure. These small long screws actually are not screwed into the fans. They're just going through both sets of holes and they're holding on to the radiator. So go back over each one and just make it tight, but not too tight. Don't over torque. And you definitely want to check each one again because I just noticed that I left that one loose down there. There we go. I'm just checking. Oh, and that was loose too. All right. All of these are now secure. We now have our radiator on the bottom and we have both of our 140 millimeter fans set to pull air through the radiator, exhausting it out the top. I will now take our flex screen and I will place it back on the top of the case so it doesn't get lost or damaged. The final step is now to put the liquid block, the water block on the actual CPU itself. Note, you can only do this once unless you happen to have spare thermal paste. No spare thermal paste comes with it, and if you don't have any spare thermal paste, well, you'll be up a creek without a paddle. In the event that you need to reapply thermal paste, either you're changing CPU or it gets touched or messed up in any way, you need something like this Arctic Silver 5, which is, as far as I know, pretty much what everybody uses. This is about $6 or $7 for a tube that should last you forever because you don't need much of it. It is the smallest dop in the world. We're not going to be using that today, but I have a tube because you never know when you might need one. As far as installing this goes, Now that this is fully secure, I can move these hoses around without worrying about the weight of the radiator itself. One thing I do want, however, is to install it in this configuration. Why? The Corsair logo lights up, and I'd like it to be right side up. That is purely an aesthetic thing. Furthermore, this is the connector where the cable goes that will connect to the USB 2 port on the bottom of the motherboard, and so that'll come out the bottom and not hitting one of the RAM slots. So I am going to attempt to keep these out of the way. In fact, just for the moment, I'll wrap them around this. And I want to make sure that my hoses are clear. And if you look, the hoses are not hitting anything. I'm having to lean over a bit. Let me do this. That's better. I move this towards me. It's a whole lot easier when it's in the right spot. So, if you look, there are 4 holes in the bracket surrounding the liquid cooler. When I take this off, the goal is to put through each of those 4 holes the posts that we installed at the beginning of this video. Remember that part? We screwed those in. They're still sitting there. I'm just going to double check them to make sure they're nice and secure. At this point, we are now going to remove the protective cover. And with these cables wrapped around so they don't hit anything, I'm going to turn this and bring it straight down on top of the CPU. We will then take our thumb screws, and I will just, for the moment, finger tighten. We'll tighten these with a screwdriver in a second. So, our water block is centered on the CPU. I am now going to take my screwdriver and I'm going to tighten each of these in place, and I'm going to rotate. I did not tighten that all the way. I'm going around in clockwise fashion. You can do clockwise if you prefer. I did not fully tighten the first one, and I'm still not fully tightening them. I'm going to make 3 passes to try to balance the weight or the pressure on the CPU. Now I'm going to make my final tightening pass, and I'm just giving it a bit of torque, but not too much torque. Twisting force. There's a bit more, okay. Last one. Let's see how solid that is now. That is very solid. That is absolutely not going anywhere. In fact, I can move the entire table this computer is on. That is absolutely not going anywhere. So, water block's installed. It's never leaving again. Knock on wood. It's never leaving again. We have these cables to worry about. Well, first of all, let me bring those under here. And then we've got these cables, which are the CPU power cables. I am actually going to run these up here because I will probably end up tying them off with these power cables to keep them from resting on the RAM. The RAM will get hot over time, so you don't want these just resting on top of the RAM lest it melt the cable. So I will tie these off on these power cables up here. And then this has to plug. This is the CPU fan connector, which actually doesn't do anything. In fact, it's just a ground plug. Why does it have to be there? It tells the motherboard there's a CPU fan installed. The water pump is not, repeat, not getting its power from that plug. But the motherboard wants to see it. If there's nothing plugged in there, the motherboard will assume that your CPU fan has failed and your system may not even boot. Now the 2 fans, I'm going to move that aside for the moment, the 2 fans that we installed, I have the cables right over here. And these install right here. Cable ties, we're going to tie all that up in a minute. Now, we need serial ATA power, which I actually did not allow for before, except I did. There is a small amount of space back here where there is a rubber grommet, and I'm going to pass that through to the back of the case. Why? Do you remember the serial ATA power connectors we left back there for the solid state drives? Now we're going to use one. I'm going to turn this over and plug that in. And here we are at the back of the case again. Here is that power connector for the liquid cooler that I passed through. Here are two of the spare, and I tied that off earlier, I suppose. Fair enough. I will have to cut this cable tie carefully so I don't cut the power cords. I'll redo that in a second. I have many cable ties, it's fine. But we are now going to use one of these power connectors to provide power. Let me turn that the correct way. To the liquid cooling. This power connector is what powers the pump on the radiator. The connector on the motherboard, actually this motherboard probably could run it, but Corsair has to design a liquid cooling system for every motherboard, and motherboard's not designed for the amperage that requires. That's why this is here, no worries. Now I am going to retie this with a fresh zip tie. That's why you want plenty. I don't actually want that on top of the data cable. If you're going to do it right. There we go. And I will now zip tie all of these back together. And I will use my cutter to cut the excess off. And we now have power. Awesome. Let's flip this back over to the other side. So now we're back to this side. We have got our radiator hoses here, which are nice and far away from everything. They're not touching anything, no problem. We do, however, have this mess. This can't stay. This has to be dealt with. Not to worry, I can loop it back on itself. All right, I had to trim out the actual zip tying of these cables simply because in order to do it, my head was in the way and you wouldn't have seen it anyway, but suffice it to say I wrapped it all up and then the cable came up from here. Now, it's worth noting that where I put the serial ATA cable did in fact go across the RAM. I'm going to mention this because what I did was I actually zip tied that cable up using the thick power cable to hold it off of the RAM. So there is a gap between the RAM and that power cable. It is being held up and over the RAM. It's not ideal, but I'm going to live with it because it's close enough and I feel comfortable it's not going to touch the RAM. So now we have one more cable that we need to connect, which is this thing. This is the data cable to connect the Corsair link to the USB 2 port. Now this cable plugs into the bottom of the cooler. You can see I've got Corsair right side up. Here's what's interesting. If you actually look at the instructions, you will see that it shows the cable coming out of the top of the unit, which is where it should come out of, not the bottom, because the video card is going to be here. You got to keep it off the video card. It's going to be one of the hottest things in the system. If it came off of here, I could run it past these cables down there and around, and it would be perfect. Go figure. So if you buy one of these and it's on the bottom, you basically have a choice. Do you want to wrap it around your water block, which might get hot? Do you want to try to pull it back and come across here? But the problem is, remember, you got a video card that's going to be coming across here. You're not going to have any room or space. You could tie it. I don't want to tie anything to a radiator hose. That's just a bad idea. You know what? It's probably going to end up zip tied to the main power cable, which is also a bad idea. But there aren't a lot of great options. I don't like that part. I will plug that into one of the USB 2 ports, and now it is zip tie time. This is why having zip ties are so handy. Because I have run out of zip ties supplied not only with this case, but I actually had a few others in another bag I went and grabbed. So now it's time for more zip ties. I am actually going to tie this cable off in two places. I don't want to bend it too hard, but you know what? It's going to get bent. There's just no way around it. I'm going to zip tie it over here to the main power cord, which I don't like doing, but I don't have anything else to zip tie it to. And frankly, it's that or the radiator cables, and that's not going to happen. Don't tie anything to the radiator cables. Now you may ask, why not tie anything to a radiator cable? You don't want any risk that over time something tied to this will eat through the outer sheathing and cause it to leak. Now, the main power cable is not a great choice either, but I don't have any other available choices, so that's where it's going. And I will cut off the excess end there. Always trim your excess. Now, the reason I got two of them is this. Now, if I can do this without leaning over, I might end up leaning over. And we are all tied off. So we've got a zip tie here holding this, basically keeping it together so it doesn't flop around. And it's also tied to the main power cable to keep it away from the video card. But wait, we are still missing one link cable. And unfortunately, this is a big one. I don't like how this is done, but it is what it is. Look at this thing. On one end, we have the connector that will plug into the power supply. And on the other, we have the USB 2 connector. Now, these are already zip tied. It came this way from Corsair. So the question is, where does this go? And they don't provide a sticky for this. And it would be nice because then I would just stick it to the top of the power supply. And I don't have any double-sided tape. So this end has to go into the power supply. So I've got one end of this plugged into the power supply, and I've got to plug the other end into the USB 2 socket on the motherboard. And now I'm left with this mess. Well, good for me. I have lots of neon green zip ties because you wouldn't want to leave this just dangling around your case. I now have that zip tied to one of the hard drive cables coming off, hard drive power cables coming off of the power supply. It's not going anywhere. Note, for anybody who looks at my cable routing and my zip tying and say, man, that doesn't look like a professional operation. What kind of computer builder are you? I'm not a professional computer builder. I've built dozens, if not hundreds of computers over the years, but people who build computers for a living, people who work for places like CyberPower PC and iBuyPower, build 100 computers in the morning. They probably build 1,000 computers a week. You would get really, really good at this really fast if you did that many. Somebody working a week at CyberPower probably builds more PCs than I've done in my life. I build a few a year, and I have built hundreds in my lifetime. I hate to say it, but I'm over 40 years old, so I've been doing this for a while. This is, however, better than what I think a lot of people do. I've built many machines and I've never done this kind of cable management. Please get yourself some zip ties, some cable ties. You will need them, you will use them. If you're building high-end systems like this, there's no excuse not to spend $5 to get a package of, in this case, 200 cable ties that will last you the rest of your life. I strongly recommend it. Furthermore, this kit over here was $20-ish or so. It's got the cutters, it's got needle nose pliers, it's got various sizes of small magnetic screwdrivers. It is very, very handy. Furthermore, if you've been watching this build, you'll notice this area over here keeps changing in between things. I'm putting cuts in here because nobody wants to watch the whole thing raw. You wouldn't want to know how long this really was. And most importantly, keeping your area neat actually makes it easier to build the system. Clean up in between steps. Let's summarize where we're at now. We have got our CPU installed, our RAM installed, our motherboard installed. We have got our main power cable, our CPU power cables. We have our liquid cooler, radiators, fans, added one fan and turned this fan around. We've added our power supply at the bottom. We have a bunch of power cables running out for our 4 hard drives and our 4 SSDs and an extra cable for future expansion. It's just nice to have already there. I definitely recommend you put an extra cable back there because it zip ties and stays in place perfectly. We have installed our NVMe Samsung 950 Pro M2 SSD here. We have put all of our data cables in, leaving 2 more plugs free for future hard drive expansion in these 2 bays. We have not installed anything in the 5¼ inch bay because, quite frankly, why? There's just no need. And so what are we left with? Video card. And the most exciting part of the build, the extra 2 USB 3 ports for the back of the computer. And here we have our EVGA GeForce GTX 1080 for the Win Edition. Now, those of you who have been following my channel may say, wait a minute, did you just open that? I thought you already did an unboxing and overview of an EVGA GeForce GTX 1080 for the Win. Yes, I know, I bought another one. Ouch, pain, ouch, the pain. Hey, if you like my videos, support me. Go click something and go buy something from Newegg or Amazon or do something down there. I would appreciate it. I will be doing SLI tests. There will be future upcoming videos where I test SLI versus non-SLI performance on these cards. That's why I got them, because people have been asking for it and everybody wants to know about it. So yes, I will have 2 of those in here. Note, I'm not installing 2 of these today, and the reason is the other one of these is currently installed in my computer at home because I game at 4K and it was worth the upgrade. I previously had a EVGA GeForce GTX 980 Ti Superclocked Edition in my machine at home, and I upgraded to a 1080. Why? It is worth it for 4K. The performance difference was noticeable. Even if you're rocking a 980 Ti and you're asking, should I upgrade to a 1080? Well, I thought so. I certainly could sell the 1080. Newegg has these in stock on the day I'm filming this, but Amazon is out of stock. I could certainly sell my 1080 there, and I wouldn't have any problem selling it. I'd probably sell that in one day. I do sell a lot of the stuff that I buy back on Amazon, and if you've ever bought anything from there, you might have bought it from me. And no, I'm not going to tell you what my seller name is there, and no, it is not Tech Deals. 2 reasons I'm not going to tell you. And it's not because it's a big secret per se, but first of all, I want to keep my business separate. And second of all, I don't want to influence any recommendations on my channel based upon my desire to sell stuff. I don't want to say something and say, quick, this is the best deal ever, go buy this now, and then I've got one for sale on Amazon. I think that's dishonest. My integrity is worth more than selling a few items. I usually have between 5 to 10 items for sale on Amazon. I'm not selling a lot of stuff. That's not my other business, is selling on Amazon. As I film this video, I have 2 video cards for sale on Amazon, and they're both older. They're both about 3 years old. So I don't have any of the current stuff for sale. I've sold everything I'm going to sell on Amazon. So don't think you're going down there and helping me out by buying a lot of stuff. Buy it directly from Amazon, quite frankly. If you're buying it new, buy it from Amazon. And virtually everything that I sell, there is plastic all over this as a side note. Virtually everything I sell is used because I've tested it. I sold, for example, I sold the MSI Gaming X GTX 1070 card that you've seen on my channel. And yes, I sold it as like new, not new. And yes, I took a small hit on what I paid for it. But I opened it, I used it, it's not new. It would be dishonest to call it new. I will never do that. Some other people have asked, while I'm busy taking all the plastic, there's so much plastic on these things. A little bit more. Some other people have asked, do I buy stuff from Amazon and return it? No. 2 reasons. One, that's unethical. I'm over 40 years old, I'm married with 3 kids. I don't have time for those games. That's dishonest. If you do that, you're abusing Amazon. You're taking advantage of their return privileges for reasons they didn't provide them. You're stealing, basically. Now, some people are going to say, but they said I could return it. Yeah, that's not what it's for. It's for people who change their minds. It's not for you to go and buy a bunch of hardware and then use it and return it. You're stealing, as far as I'm concerned. So don't do that. Second, Amazon bans buyers. Don't believe me? Google search, Amazon banned buyer. Forums are full of people who got banned for life from buying from Amazon for buying and returning too many things. I specifically remember one person who complained bitterly a couple years ago in the forums who said, I bought 3 laptops to test them out and returned 2 of them. What's Amazon complaining about? Well, they're not a tryout service. Don't abuse them. They'll ban you. So don't do that. You won't get away from it for very long. All right, now I have trimmed out most of that video because I was taking all the plastic off. If you buy one of these cards, there's plastic here, 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 and here. There's plastic across the top here. There's a sheet of plastic on the back. Isn't this a nice looking card? That is absolutely gorgeous. Now I can't install it yet because I got to take the back plates off, but I wanted to go ahead and get the card out. Take my screwdriver, which is right here, and there are 2 of these that you need to unscrew. Now these are thumb screws, but it's much easier to do with a regular screwdriver. And then with a magnetic screwdriver, you're not going to have it drop down. If you ever want to run your system without a video card, save these. Frankly, is this computer ever likely to not have a video card? No! That CPU has no integrated graphics, so we have to have a video card. So now we're going to install our graphics card. Graphics cards go straight in and straight out. However, because of this lip here and because of this edge, you have to offset a bit towards the front of the case, which is that way. Once you clear this lip, then you come back over before you hit the motherboard. So there's a very small clearance between where this clears the side of the case and this hits the motherboard. And I just have to hold the cable slightly out of the way, and we'll bring this down. And that's all there is to it. Now, I quickly did something before I installed it just to make the point. Make sure that your retention tab is down, not up. It will pop up automatically, but make sure that's down before you put the card in. I did that just before I inserted it, but make sure you do that. Make sure you screw the screws back in to secure the card. And it's a double slot card, so you use both of them. This is why we install the graphics card last. Take a look at the end of the graphics card and take a look at the cables. Trying to run cables when the graphics card is installed is challenging to say the least. Furthermore, all of our hard drives and half the SSDs are installed right where the video card is. Those would be next to impossible to install. In fact, if I ever wanted to change those cables and change what's plugged in, I would take the graphics card out. It would be much, much easier. Now this graphics card has 2 8-pin PCI Express power connectors. Not a problem. We have got a cable here that has one connector that plugs into the power supply, and the other is an 8-pin PCI Express power connector. And then we have a second one. And then we have a third one. And then we have a fourth one. Wait, why do we need 4, you ask? There's only 2. SLI, remember? I'm going to go ahead and plug them in because I will be using them when I put the second 1080 in here. Will I keep the 2 1080s? I don't know yet. I'm actually going to withhold my judgment and put my anti-bias cap on. I'm going to test this in 4K with 1 card and with 2. I will be doing live benchmarks on the table, showing you the video of it, and we'll see how the experience is. I'll try a variety of games, and then I'll let you know whether I'm keeping it. I absolutely could sell it and either get all of my money back if it's not in stock, or at least get 80 to 90% of it. I'm going to withhold my judgment and give it a try without my bias cap on. So we need to install some power cables for this. These are big, massive cables. More cable management time. Now these need to be installed under where the hard drive power connectors are. So I'm going to trim out the installation of these and show that to you here in a second. And we're back. I've now got my 4 6+2 pin PCI Express power connectors connected to the power supply, run underneath the cables, which I had to lean over to do, which is why I trimmed it out, but they're basically plugged in where they belong in the power supply. Now 2 of these, and I'm going to take these 2, are going to be installed right here into the video card. Now 6+2 power connectors have a 6-piece and a 2-piece, and you put them together. There's a little tab, and you install them as one. You have to hold them together when you install them to make sure that they stay together, just like so. We'll now take our second one. Those went in very easily. I have worked with other power supplies that they didn't go in easily. Good power supply, ridiculously expensive, but good power supply. Now I've got these 2 big cables sitting here. This may happen to you. I'm actually going to fix this. Take a look at the twist, if you can see it in this cable. That is too much twist. I should have checked the twist before I did it, but that's okay. I'm human. I'm going to untwist the cable, reattach the connectors, and reinsert. Do it right. Takes 2 seconds to fix. Now I'm going to take these and again, cable manage. Now, when I install the second card, I will probably cut the tie on this and then re-cable manage, but for now, this works well enough. And so I've got my cable management in place. I simply loop them back where they were originally. I put a nice neon green tie around it. Use a different color if it bothers you. I honestly don't care. This sits under my desk. I don't look at it anyway. And so we've got our cables plugged in here. This is not resting against the metal of the cooler. Don't worry, this is actually big enough and heavy enough it's sitting up, but now it's not bothering anything. When I put the second graphics card in for the SLI test, I will cut this, run these in, and then retie it all together. These, I'm actually going to loop around and I'll zip tie them together. I now have those cables zip tied. They are resting on the bottom of the case. If you take a look here, you'll see that I've tied them both together, but they're also loose. They're not connected. They're heavy. They're not going anywhere, and they rest perfectly at the bottom of the case. Other than taking this home, other than putting it on the test stand, this doesn't go anywhere. That's not going to go anywhere. That doesn't bother me. They're heavy. They're going to stay at the bottom of the case. When I install the second video card, I will cut those ties, cut this tie, and I will hook them all up and then retie everything. So I'll do it properly. Again, the nice thing about having 200 cable ties for $5 is I'm not worried about using ties. I know I've said that like 3 or 4 times in this video, but if you can afford to build a $2,000+ computer, this is $4, but it's overkill for most people. $2,000 would be a nice budget for this machine. If you've got $2,000 to build on this machine, you've got $5 for proper cable ties. Our system build is complete. Hang on, don't go anywhere. The next video coming up right after this is going to be Windows installation, where we install Windows, set up the drivers, and configure everything. After that will be Windows performance. Then I'm going to be doing SSD performance testing, hard drive performance testing with Windows storage spaces, game performance videos with both 1 and 2 GTX 1080 graphics cards. I will be doing live overclocking on this computer. I will show you both the automatic overclocking through the Asus software as well as manual overclocking. I will be doing 3D rendering and video rendering benchmarks for the first time on my channel on this computer. So lots and lots of videos coming up. If you've watched this far, you are totally awesome and I appreciate it. 2 thumbs up to you. Like this video if you like it. Don't if you don't. Remember to subscribe to my channel. The big, huge red button right down there. Questions and comments, go in the comment section below. There's got to be some comments on this. There's so much stuff going on. By all means, let me know what you think down there. The video description, please check out the video description. Click the View More or See More button below it. It'll expand and have all the details. All of these parts will be linked to both Amazon and Newegg. Amazon and Newegg are very good to me, so be good to them and go buy something. Both companies offer exceptional customer service. Every single thing you see here was bought from either Amazon and Newegg. Different parts were bought from different companies. Both of them are exceptional, and I highly recommend them without any reservation. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.